In verse 6 of 2 Corinthians 3, Rabbi Paul says he has even made us competent to be workers of the new covenant. So he kind of gives us a hint at where this is going. Something new speaks of revelation. And just as a message requires a messenger, a revelation requires a revelator. So who is this revelator that we're talking to about? And who is this one that Rabbi Paul is referring to? Well, in Deuteronomy 18 we see this prophecy. I will raise a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him. It shall come about that whoever will not listen to my words, which he speaks in my name, I myself will require it of him. With this revelation, we see that the up-and-coming prophet, even in traditional Judaism, they see this as speaking of Messiah himself, would hold the key to a new and a greater understanding, something enhancing upon and developing upon that which was established through Moshe. So again, even the Torah further hints of this covenantal transition and progression. The rabbis of old saw this text in Deuteronomy and recognized that there would be changes to the Torah within the kingdom of Messiah. What can often be seen in both apocryphal literature, kind of intertestament type of literature, Maccabees, Baruch, Esdras, some of these pretty amazing books actually, as well as Talmudic literature, which is the work of the rabbis, the compendium, the Talmud, is sort of an amended Torah, which is a very interesting concept. One somewhat reminiscent of the Torah given at Sinai, but different in many respects. Now this is built upon, if you remember the conversation that Yeshua had with some of the leaders when they talked about marriage in the kingdom of heaven. And Yeshua said that the Torah is only binding while you're living here on earth. Well, this is the same understanding that the rabbis have today. That the Torah, so to speak, is only binding upon man and women while we're living here on earth. But when the kingdom of Messiah comes, and Messiah, who is the ultimate revelator, manifested in this section of Scripture here, he will not necessarily, well, some rabbis teach that he will completely change the whole Torah and we'll have a brand new Torah. But then there are other rabbis that say, well, he will amend certain things that were applicable here in this life will not necessarily bind us in the kingdom that is yet to come. And I think to a certain extent, Yeshua spoke of that, to a certain extent. Although we'll see here that there's a lot more to that. One reminiscent of the Torah given at Sinai, but different in many respects. And this is one of the traditions that is taught in Judaism today. The Holy One, blessed be He, will sit in paradise and give instruction, and all the righteous will sit before Him, and all the hosts of heaven will stand on His right, and the stars on His left. And the Holy One, blessed be He, interprets to them the grounds of a new Torah, which the Holy One, blessed be He, will give to them by the hand of King Messiah. That to me is fascinating, not only because of the text, but also because of Joseph's dream of the stars. Bowing down to Him, the hosts of heaven. Very prophetic indeed. So again, this is what the rabbis have been teaching for a very, very long time. This idea of progress, although I don't necessarily agree with that level of progress, of complete and total change, I do agree with the words of Yeshua, our Master, that there are certain things that are not necessarily binding in the kingdom of heaven as they are to us now. The idea was and continues to be that our relationship with our Creator evolves based on new revelation. This understanding within Judaism all stems from the idea of a revelator who is greater than Moses, our previous text in Deuteronomy 18. And they take that very seriously. When this prophet would utter his words, he would be seen as the final authoritative interpreter of God's Torah. Another crucial aspect within the Jewish world and the Jewish mind, that in order for one to be considered the Messiah, he of course would have to be able to perfectly and correctly interpret the Torah. He would be its final authoritative interpreter. In the Gospel of Matthew, we see that the rabbis were right when it came to this idea of authoritative interpretation. And I know that we tend to beat this text to death almost in the way in which we recite it, but I want to recite it once again to help those who are new kind of have this understanding. Do not think that I came to abolish the Torah or the prophets. I did not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Now, some sections say the literal, which is to destroy or to demolish. Of course, we know Yeshua as the final authoritative interpreter of Torah. Of course, he did not come to abolish or do away with, but he didn't come to destroy. But as some of you know, in the first century, the idea of destruction or building up the Torah had quite a different understanding. To destroy or abolish and fulfill were first century rabbinic terms having everything to do with interpretation. When a rabbi felt that another was misinterpreting the Torah, he would say, "You are destroying the law or the Torah." When one was correctly interpreting the Torah, it was said of him, "You are fulfilling the Torah." Now, this to me is amazing, okay? Because we see to a certain extent that Jewish thought is very, very connected with the way in which Messiah taught. Very much so. He came to fulfill. What do you mean? He came to be the final authoritative instructor, the final authoritative interpreter of the Torah. He was saying, in me, Deuteronomy 18 is fulfilled. It is fulfilled in me. I am the one who you have been looking for to fully and correctly, adequately and authoritatively interpret the Torah. It was taught that one of the requirements for one to be considered was to be, excuse me, I just read that there. Excuse that little spot there. It is really on these hopes in Deuteronomy 18 that the Torah ends, as it proclaims, since that time no prophet has risen in Israel like Moshe, whom Adonai knew face to face. Not Deuteronomy 18, but Deuteronomy 34. So the Torah leaves us hanging on to hope that someone, that something greater is on the horizon, is yet to come, and that the work done through Moses is pointing in a certain direction. During his time, there was none like the prophet Moses, yet he is told that one greater than him is on his way. So the Torah ends with messianic expectation, anticipation. So where in the scriptures do we see this idea of newness? Well, the topic of the day is indeed the new covenant. So let's fast forward to Jeremiah 31 through 34. Behold, days are coming, declares Adonai, when I will make a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Yehudah, not like the covenant which I made with their fathers in the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. My covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them, declares Adonai. But this is the covenant which I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares Adonai. I will put my Torah within them, and on their heart I will write it. And I will be their God, and they shall be my people. They will not teach again each man his neighbor and each man his brother, saying, Know Adonai, for they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest of them, declares Adonai. For I will forgive their iniquity, and their sin I will remember no more. Before we begin to dissect this text and all its implications, I'd like to take a look at the term New Covenant, as it helps us to understand really the nature of covenant. Of course, Greek Hadashah, if you just say New Covenant, if you say the New Covenant, you put a hey in front of it, it's Habrit HaChadashah. Coming from the Hebrew root Hadash, which more than brand new really means renewed. To do again, to restore. I love this word, to repair. Think of the broken tablets. Think of the broken hearts of Israel. Now we see two biblical illustrations that scholars have agreed essentially are the essence of this term. The primary sense biblically is the idea of polishing a sword. The significance of newness appears to proceed from that of a sharp, polished sword. Now think about that idea. The sword already exists. What you're doing is that you're renewing it. You're allowing its shine. You're creating a beautiful luster there. How many of you have polished sterling silver before? You have yes silver. You've got all this silver that looks like bronze now because it's been sitting there for so long. And you get out, the material, and lo and behold, my wife Leah did this last week, and I asked her where you got this. Well, it's so beautiful. Well, it was sitting on our shelf for the last several years, but now I notice it because it's gleaming and it's beautiful. This is this idea of Hadash, much more than brand new. It's a renewing of that which has previously existed. And again, of course, the second illustration biblically is this idea of Chodesh, coming from that root Hadash. Rosh Chodesh, the new month, the new moon. The moon has always existed, hasn't it? Mm-hmm. But yet it gets renewed. And all of Israel's festivals, spiritual life, throughout the centuries is all measured by this idea of renewing of the moon. The moon has existed. And of course, in Isaiah 66, we see that in the end of days, there are two times when all men, women, and children will gather before the Lord in the Messianic kingdom. On the Shabbat and on the new moon. Those two times. So, that concept of renewing is a beautiful thing. Both of these illustrations highlight a sense of polishing and renewing something that already exists, and this is really the nature of the New Covenant. In many ways, it is a renewal of something previously established. This can be seen in the one time that the term New Covenant is used in the Gospels. Of course, we know that's in Luke 22. And when he had taken some matzah and given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, "This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me." He did the same thing with the cup after the meal, saying, "This cup is the new covenant, ratified by my blood, which is being poured out for you." Now, he's not necessarily talking about the idea of communion. I don't want to try to offend anyone, although communion is based on this, but this is a Passover Seder, and I think most of you know that. Mm-hmm. This is the third cup, the cup of redemption, which Yeshua lifted up. And Yeshua says this is the cup of the new covenant. Now, it's interesting. This is where the Greek and the Hebrew melt together beautifully, because even the Greek term literally means renewed covenant. And there are two different Greek words. The other word you may be familiar with, neo, comes from the Greek word neos. You've all heard, the term neo, neocon, neo this, neo that. Well, neo is something that is derived, that has never existed before. It's brand new. Whereas Luke, who was a non-Jewish doctor, although a God-fearer, and obviously very intelligent when it came to the use of the Greek language, chooses the correct Greek word here. Because it wasn't brand new. It was renewed. It's a renewing of something that already existed. It didn't discard, it built upon the beauty of that which came previously. God did not change, and his purpose didn't change, and neither did his ways. Again, what begins to quote-unquote change is the way in which we relate to God, the way in which we relate to his previous covenants. And so how do we reconcile this text in Jeremiah, which declares, "Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers, the covenant or the Mosaic covenant which they broke, although I was a husband to them." Well, what does the contrast entail? The contrast is not between two separate ways of salvation or two different methods of worship, one old and one new. The main contrast has to do with repairing the nation's approach to God.